Aye.
Good evening, Vacaville. Hope everyone enjoyed Father's Day and Juneteenth and a nice break. I will now call the regular Planning Commission meeting of Tuesday, June 20th, 2023 to order, and will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Chair Klein.
Present.
Vice Chair Rudine. Commissioner Wilkerson. Commissioner Fortney.
Here.
Commissioner Vargas. Commissioner Lightfoot. Commissioner Banta. Chair, we have a quorum.
Excellent, thank you. Everyone please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and I will ask Commissioner Banta to please lead us in the salute to the flag.
The flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands.
That was better than my first time doing it. I think I went into officiating a wedding as part of my pledge. It was a disaster. So thank you for that. Our next item, we will now move on with the regular business, starting off with staff communications. At this time, I will ask staff if there are any communications or announcements for this evening's meeting.
Thank you, Chair Klein. We have no new communications and no announcements.
Wonderful, thank you. On to item 4, approval of the agenda. This includes the continuance of the 2 public hearing items as shown on the agenda. If there are no changes, do I have a motion and then a second to approve the agenda?
Motion.
Moved by Commissioner Fortney. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Wilkerson. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Wilkerson.
Yes.
Commissioner Fortney.
Yes.
Banta. Yes. Vice Chair Rudine. Yes. Chair Klein.
Yes. The item passes. Our next item is business from the floor. This portion of the agenda is available for the public to address the Planning Commission on any issue that is not on the agenda. There will be a limit of 3 minutes per speaker. At this time, I welcome anyone who wishes to address the Commission regarding a topic or issue that is not on the agenda this evening to please approach the podium. Seeing none, I will now close the business from the floor, and we'll move on to the consent calendar. We have one item on the consent, which are the minutes from the May 16, 2023 meeting. Does anyone from the Commission or the public wish to pull the consent item for discussion? Okay, seeing none, do I have a motion and a second to approve the consent calendar?
Motion.
Been moved by Commissioner Fortney. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Vice Chair Rudine. Will the clerk please call the roll vote?
Commissioner Wilkerson.
Yes.
Commissioner Fortney.
Yes.
Commissioner Banta. Yes. Vice Chair Rudine. Yes. Chair Klein.
Yes. The item passes. We will now move to item 7. This is the time for public hearing on the first matter here, Dutch Bros and multi-tenant commercial building, which is continued to July 18, 2023. Likewise, item B, the North Village Area Plan 2, has been continued to July 18, 2023. With that, we will now move to item A, which is business. So we'll move on from public hearings. This is to receive, so we'll receive a presentation on the 2023 housing legislation. We will first hear a presentation by staff, followed by commissioner questions, and then we will open it up for public comment. May we please have the staff presentation. Tyra.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. So as noted, tonight we're going to do a general overview of the new 2023 housing legislation that's gone into effect. Tonight's item is simply a business item meant to provide information to the commission, and therefore no action will be requested. In 2017, the existing Housing Accountability Act was amended to publicly declare that California has a housing supply and affordability crisis of historic proportions. Since this time, over 150 pieces of housing legislation has been introduced at the state level, though not all of it has passed. That's not to say that the cities and counties of California have not experienced large numbers of new legislation they must contend with on an annual basis. It was noted in 2022 that the state would need at least 320,000 new homes built annually the next 8 years in order to provide the amount of housing necessary to meet all of California's needs. Now, this number grew exponentially from the 2018 numbers, which then stated that the state needed to provide 180,000 units annually. So what this is demonstrating is every year that goes by that the state does not build a sufficient number of homes, that problem impounds exponentially. And therefore, every year, the state passes new legislation that we must comply with in order to encourage the development of new housing units affordable to all income groups. So in February of this year, a few members of the commission had asked for additional information regarding housing legislation. This was based on a handout that was provided to the commission that provided a very high-level review of all the new bills that went into effect January of this year. Some of those bills include the ones you see on your screen here, and we will be going through them one by one at a high level. So the first one had to do with a new bill, Assembly Bill 2097, that does not require parking minimums within half mile of public transit. This is all focused on the definition of what is public transit. So this bill identifies or defines public transit as being those transit stops, those major transit stops, which include either bus, rail, or ferries that have either bus or rail providing service to those units, or I'm sorry, not units, to those facilities. Vacaville does not have any major transit stops. The only major transit stops in Solano County exist in Vallejo, in Fairfield with the train station, and in Sassoon, where there's also another train station. Both of those train stations provide stations for Caltrain, which then provides access to the Greater Bay Area. So as such, this bill, which does not allow jurisdictions to require parking minimums within 1/2 mile of public transit, is not applicable to the city of Vacaville at this time. The next bill has to do with increased requirements on the city's housing element annual progress reports that is prepared annually and submitted to the state by April 1st of each year. So this piece of legislation now requires that the city provides additional housing information as it pertains to homes affordable to extremely low-income households. Extremely low-income households, those are demonstrated by households making 30% or less of the county's area median income. Prior to this bill going into place, the city was already required to report on all the other income groups. So, let's see. The next one is also related to the Housing Annual Progress Report. This requirement provides HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the power to not only review the annual reports, but to require cities and counties to go back and revise any of these reports as deemed necessary. Given the growing complexity of this APR, it's very common to have oversights, mistakes, or incomplete information submitted to the state on an annual basis. Well, in order to ensure that cities and jurisdictions are doing the best they can to encourage the production of housing, HCD is now scrutinizing these reports at a higher level, and therefore they can now kick it back to us and say, we need either additional information or we need you to correct it. The city is then given a certain amount of time to review the comments received and resubmit it to the state. Failure to submit it back to the state could result in HCD alerting the Attorney General of California. The next law is Assembly Bill 2295. This has to do with educational employee housing. As you may know, in some areas, mainly in the Greater Bay Area region, a lot of teachers cannot afford to reside in the jurisdiction in which they teach. As such, this bill, as well as I believe the next one, I can't remember if I have it on here or not, it does allow educational agencies to construct affordable housing on their properties for the sole purpose of providing housing to teachers. Now, if someone or if a unified school district here in town, we have more than one, as you know, were to construct homes on their properties, those building permits would be issued by the state architect's office, and therefore the city would not be able to claim those units towards our regional housing needs allocation as required by our housing element. So there is another bill, as I sort of alluded to. It's identified at the bottom of this screen, and that is Assembly Bill 1719. It's very similar. This bill allows community colleges to do something very similar in terms of building housing on their properties. However, that housing has to be affordable to faculty members or other people working within those colleges. It's not limited to teachers specifically. And lastly, in terms of the 5 pieces of legislation that we had talked about a little bit in February, would be Assembly Bill 2873. This has to do with promoting diversity in affordable housing development. So through, I don't have my notes, sorry. So through different funding mechanisms, the state looks at ways to encourage affordable housing developers to increase the amount of diversity within their hiring practices and within their, their hiring practices and their building practices. So what the state is doing is they are providing incentives through funding if these affordable housing producers hire minority workers that include, but it's by all means not limited to LGBTQ, I'm not sure if I got that right, plus minorities, women-based, things of that nature. So it's all based on providing diversity. This is not done at the local level. This is done at the high level, having to do with funding once again, and therefore this is not directly related to Vacaville. Okay, so from here on, we're going to talk about some other pieces of legislation that I do not believe this commission has reviewed before. All of these bills have gone into effect as of January of this year, unless otherwise stated. So here we have combined 2 pieces of legislation. We have SB 6 and AB 2011, and both of these allow residential development in commercial zones. Residential development is only allowed in those commercial zones in which office, retail, or parking are the principally permitted uses within those designations. In other words, you're not going to be allowed to have residential units in industrial parks. That was never the intent, nor is the law written that way. So while the 2 pieces of legislation are similar, they are slightly different. So SB 6, with those projects, the developer may invoke Senate Bill 35 and, of course, the Housing Accountability Act. They must meet several requirements, a lot of it having to do with the amount of affordable units that they provide. These developments are not exempt from CEQA, and not all the units have to be affordable, but the majority does. AB 2011 is subject to a ministerial review, and it is exempt from CEQA, but 100% of those units must be affordable unless they are mixed use. And I believe with mixed use, only 15% of those units must be affordable. But again, both pieces of legislation requires a developer to meet a whole host of requirements in order to build new residential units in these commercial zones. While it's possible someone could come into the city of Vacaville and make this request, it's probably not likely for as long as the city retains a healthy inventory of lands specifically identified for residential development. The next piece of legislation is SB 897, and this has to do with accessory dwelling units. This is something that you probably hear about every year, and you can probably count on continuing to hear about changes in ADU legislation annually. So in this case, the state has decided to make the creation of ADUs even more attractive by allowing them in detached garages. They're now allowing up to 2 detached ADUs to be built concurrently with a brand new multifamily apartment complex. They've also increased the allowed height of ADUs, as shown here on the screen. You can read that one for yourself. And they also allow ADUs within the front yards. There were some changes also having to do with setbacks. I should note, with ADUs, this is something that will be addressed in the city's Land Use and Development Code, that will be amended as it typically is to ensure that we are always consistent with state law. So the next grouping of legislative bills include AB 916, AB 2668. So AB 916, it's a little bit of an odd one, but what it does, it allows any homeowner to build up to 2 new bedrooms on their property without the need of a public hearing. That's all it says. AB 2668, this is a cleanup to Senate Bill 35. So what this bill is doing, it's very clear, stating that any project that comes in with an SB 35 application is not subject to a non-legislative discretionary approval. In other words, it is not subject to design review or site review. It also notes that the affordable units are calculated on the base density of that zoning district only. So it's simply a cleanup to an already pretty comprehensive piece of legislation. So the next grouping of legislative bills include those related to the density bonus. This is one that typically changes annually as well. So in this case, the first piece of legislation, AB 682, has to do with shared housing buildings. Sometimes they're called co-housing buildings. These are now going to be deemed eligible for density bonuses. AB 1551, this extends the density bonus law to include mixed-use projects up until January of 2028. Currently, mixed-use buildings, to my knowledge, are not subject to density bonuses. AB 2334 allows 100% affordable projects to have unlimited density only if they're in very low vehicular traffic areas in a designated county. To be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but in state law, it does identify Solano County as being one of those counties. So therefore, a 100% affordable development within Solano County, which of course includes Vacaville, is allowed to have unlimited density if it's 100% affordable. The next grouping of laws have to do with a couple of different things. So these are all related to housing element requirements and other pieces of the general plan. So the first one has to do, this is AB 2339, has to do with the city being required to provide or permit emergency shelters within a zone that permits residential units. This is already identified in our draft housing element, And if that housing element is approved, this is something that staff will be implementing in the very near future. Senate Bill 1425 has to do with requiring all cities to update their conservation and open space elements of their general plan. And this update must take place prior to January 1st, 2026. And very similar to our community health, very similar to our community health policies, we need to incorporate those type of policies into conservation and open space. So we need to deal with climate resilience, and we need to address social, economic, and racial equality as it relates to open space. In case you're wondering, the reason that we're not already addressing this came after the fact. We learned about this bill after the existing draft community health policies had already been drafted. So this was a latecomer. So that's pretty much the pieces of legislation that are directly related to land use or the housing element. However, we thought it would be important for the the commission to know that almost all pieces of legislation being put into place this year, as well as future years, all really stem off a few pieces of core legislation. Those principal housing laws include the Housing Accountability Act. This act was originally approved in 1982, and very similar to the housing element law that was put in place in 1969, it was deemed to be very ineffective for many, many years because there were no ramifications for jurisdictions not implementing it. That all changed in 2017. 2017, if you recall, that is when the state officially acknowledged that the state has a severe housing shortage of historic proportions. So through that, they gave a lot of teeth to the Housing Accountability Act with the passage of Senate Bill 35, which was proposed and approved by Skinner. So what the Housing Accountability Act does, and this came directly out of a couple different things I'd read, it establishes the state's overarching policy that local government may not delay, reduce the density of, or make housing development projects infeasible. So to put it in a different way, if a project comes in and it meets all the criteria as identified in the law, it's consistent with all the objective design and development standards, it follows all the rules, the city must approve it, unless it can make one of two findings, which is very challenging to do. And that's simply to say that the impacts cannot be mitigated unless the project is denied. So the only way a city can deny a housing application that comes in that's been filed with an SB 35 application, which of course is implementing the Housing Accountability Act, is if they can make one of two findings, and both of them essentially state the only way a city or a county can deny that application is if it can be shown and proven that the only way to avoid an unmitigatable impact is to deny the project. I cannot think of an example off the top of my head, but the burden of proof is put on the jurisdiction. But otherwise, if it meets all the criteria, objective design development standards, we have to approve it. State is quite serious about meeting its housing crisis. It wants us to address it, and it's holding us accountable. That is not only shown through these new pieces of legislation, but it's also shown in our annual progress report, which we must submit annually. And every year they want more and more information to ensure that we are indeed implementing all these pieces of legislation. So as I had mentioned earlier, actually I said SB 35, my apologies. It was SB 330 that bolstered the Housing Accountability Act. SB 330 was approved in January 2020, and this is the one that strengthened the Housing Accountability Act. It is truly intended to increase housing production, as we had mentioned. We only have to provide about 320,000 new homes annually for the next 8 years to meet our quota. No pressure there. Let's see. So this is the one, if someone comes in with an application, an SB 330 application, which you may recall, we've had a couple come in, we must follow the law in terms of how many meetings these projects have. And we've got to be very careful to ensure that an application comes in and meets all the criteria as identified in the law. So, oh, here are the findings. So yes, the only way a city or a county can deny one of these projects is, or even reduce its density, is if we can make those findings. So yeah, we had mentioned projects must comply with all objective development and design standards. The last principal housing law that applies practically to all projects nowadays is SB 35. This is the Permit Streamlining Act. So any project that comes in with the SB 35 application is required to be reviewed and processed by the city within 90 or 180 days, depending on what type of project it is. At least half of those units have to be affordable to lower incomes. And when it says lower incomes, it's referring to anyone who makes 80% or less of the county's area median income. These projects are subject to ministerial review. They are indeed exempt from CEQA, which is a huge incentive for nonprofits to build these units. They must be consistent with all objective design and development standards. And as of right now, the city of Vacaville has not received any SB 35 applications so far, and we believe it has to do with the fact that at least half the units must be affordable to lower incomes. That was a very quick, high-level overview of housing legislation. There's going to be a lot more to come in years. There's a lot, let me rephrase that. We can expect a lot of additional pieces of legislation in the years to come. I do believe just based on the past, we will continue to see changes in density bonus law, ADU law, and perhaps some of these other pieces of legislation that makes more housing applications ministerial by nature. And everything is likely to become subject only to objective standards, no more subjective standards. And just to do a little plug on the housing element, there are a couple of programs in the draft housing element that does call for the city to re-review its brand new land use and development code to ensure that all of our development and design standards are indeed objective in nature. So that is the end of my very quick presentation. I'm sure it was all crystal clear. That said, though, I will do my best to answer any questions the commission may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyra. I just have can you go back to slide 16? I think there was a typo there that might have been a little confusing. The second to last bullet leaves us sort of hanging on that or. I didn't want to interrupt you, but if you could just tell us what that is actually referring to.
I will do so. One moment, I want to make sure I get it absolutely correct because it is very important.
I see commissioners also will have questions for you. We'll go down the line, starting with Commissioner Wilkerson. After we can get that answer, please.
Just a 3:30. Okay. So what this should have said is it lists the two findings a city or county must make if they were to either deny a project that comes in under SB 330 or to reduce its density. And those findings are based on a preponderance of evidence, and we must show that the housing development project would have a specific adverse impact on the public health or safety unless the project is denied or approved at a lower residential density. That's finding number one. And in case you want to follow along, this is found on page 17 of your staff report. The other finding is there is no feasible method to satisfactorily mitigate or avoid the adverse impact except by denying the project or reducing the project density. That's what that one should say. I do believe that there was another slide and for some reason it got cut out. I do apologize for that.
So it should say all of that?
Yes.
Okay.
I wasn't going to read it
That'd be its
verbatim.
own slide, I think.
It would be its own slide.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Wilkerson.
Real quick, just a quick question. I think it was slide 15, where it was SB 35, and then you were talking about 35. Well, it was SB 35, and then we went on to SB through 30, but then you said you misspoke. Can you just clarify that for me, what you were referring to?
So where I had misspoke is I had noted incorrectly that SB 35 had bolstered the Housing Accountability Act in 2017, where in reality, it was SB 330, the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. You're welcome.
Yeah, mine's following up right on where you were going with the bullet point there. It was health and safety. And if I remember right, when the SB 330 came in on Southtown, it was determined traffic does not fall under a finding for health and safety, correct?
Concerns about increased traffic do not provide the basis for a.
It could be mitigated, so, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much for all of that information. So I'm still new to this, but there's a lot of new legislation, right, for increased housing production, which is one, but then there's a goal for affordability, right? At what point is and I know that's not anybody here, but at what point is the legislation going to require it to be affordable? Right now, it seems like the legislation is making it easier for developers, but it's not requiring developers to make it affordable. So why would a developer have any reason to want to make affordable housing? They're not going to make more money off of it.
It's a fair question. One thing that the city could do, and it's something that we are currently considering, is a city can adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance. And if the city were to do that, a developer who comes in would be required to permit or to provide a certain amount of affordable housing along with their market rate housing. So that is one of those programs that is called for in our housing element. And if you would like to know more about that, I know Director Morris has been working with our city council on that. I'm sure she can elaborate. Okay. But as of right now, to my knowledge, I can't think of any piece of legislation that requires that things be affordable, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were to come at some future time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Klein. I just want to add that, because the question was really about what the state is doing to require. Really, in the past, the main way they've made housing happen is by offering state funding to invest in housing. At this point, those sources are limited, and while they remain limited, they haven't had that carrot to really facilitate the production of housing. But that really goes hand in hand with a lot of their legislation.
Thank you for your presentation. So I'd like to go to the AB 2295, AB 1719, and SB 886, which is with regards with schools, which I know isn't really going to impact us here in Vacaville at the moment, but a few years back, well, quite a few years back, I remember there was something proposed down in the South Bay. And I remember talking to a former city manager about this, and he said, well, that can't happen because it's discriminatory. Is that still an issue? Or is that out the window? Is there anything that will hold up teacher and faculty housing? And I ask because I remember when Costa Compact came out in, I think it was 18, a ton of land use legislation came out and they were clamoring over themselves. And some of them actually found out to be, well, that actually wasn't legal. And so some laws got revoked. So there's a lot going out with teacher housing. And I'd like to state that I am very, very for teacher housing. It has helped a lot of cities down in the South Bay, or not just South Bay, excuse me, the Bay Area and other places. Are there any roadblocks at all to it? Is like the discriminatory part, is that no longer an issue?
So I should have prefaced this entire presentation on the fact that I'm not an attorney.
Oh,
so I'm only reading this from a planner's perspective.
Right.
And I can tell you in the laws, there's no mention of that.
Okay.
It's very specific in terms of what they can and cannot do.
Okay.
But as to whether or not there's any type of discrimination, that's something I would have to look forward to our city attorney's office to address.
Okay, okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. I can't probably give you like a real detailed legal analysis on the spot, but you know, the Fair Employment and Housing Act is still, you know, a valid law in the state of California. And so what we've seen with some of these Housing Accountability Act changes, Housing Crisis Act changes, is that there is some conflict of law situations that we're running into with, you know, potentially FEHA and those things. And so what kind of needs to happen is those challenges need to occur. But right now, the state is generally very focused on getting that housing built. And so to the extent they've made these carve outs, I think that there's going to be. But I think it's one of those we're going to have to wait and see, because when there's a conflict of law, there's a conflict of law, and then it has to go to the court and get figured out.
Okay, and because for me, I wouldn't want a developer to hold up a project. I mean, not even just for us in Vacaville, but I mean, anywhere, hold up a project just wondering, going, well, is this going to get challenged in court? So that was one question I had. I'll stop there for now. See if there's any other commissioners with questions.
One, I forgot to say thank you so much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. But on that topic, how many parcels of land does Solana Community College, Vacaville Unified, or Triumphs Unified currently own in the city of Vacaville? Or acreage amount?
We don't have that readily available. I do know that Solana Community College does have about 80 acres or so in the North Village area. As for the other acreage, we'd have to look it up and come back to you with that information.
Or just in an email, maybe get that information figured out. Just curious as to those numbers. I know Travis Unified owns a pretty sizable parcel. So, okay. And then, can you explain the difference between subjective and objective standards?
Yes. So objective standards can be answered with a simple yes or no. Does a project meet a specific requirement? Is it under, for example, is it under 30 feet? Yes or no? Is it set back 10 feet away from the road? Yes or no? There's no interpretation necessary. Something either meets the requirement or it doesn't. Subjective would include language, something similar to the development must be similar or complementary to the surrounding neighborhood. How do you quantify that? So we are no longer allowed to rely on subjective language, and we must focus on objective language. This provides a certain level of comfort for developers. They can look at our requirements and know with a certain amount of certainty that yes, they are indeed consistent with what's required, or they are not. So in the past, a lot of jurisdictions would use subjective language to either support a development or maybe stop a development, and the state no longer permits that. That's been changing over the last few years, but more and more they're becoming more strict in where and when we have to use it.
Well, on the theme of strict, okay, sorry, I forgot what my other question was. Okay, so I've been trying to wrap my head around SB 35, SB 6, and what was it, AB 2011. Okay, so I know that it probably won't impact us at this point, but as I was trying to read about SB 35, something I had found was that it provides a streamlined ministerial approval process for jurisdictions that have not made sufficient progress towards their RENA number. So is that a qualifier to have an SB 35 application? Is that RENA across the board? Because we've done very well for moderate and above moderate and like other states. So would a developer not able to do an SB 35?
So I'm not going to get this number right. Of the 520 something cities and counties in California, every single one of them is subject to SB 35 because not one has been able to meet its RENA 100%.
So that that's kind of the threshold?
It is.
Oh.
So I can't remember the two criteria.
Okay.
One is if a jurisdiction doesn't meet 50% of the arena,
Okay.
then the criteria for an SB 35 project is lower.
Okay.
If a jurisdiction meets 80% of the arena, then the criteria for an SB 35 project is higher.
Oh, it's tiered.
So it is tiered.
Okay.
And Vacaville is in that higher tier.
Okay. Okay. So kind of going along the theme of getting stricter, and as you were talking about with SB 330, this is, I guess, more of a comment more than a question. Well, I guess it's a question. So AB 2011, or SB 6, I'm sorry, is that kind of like tying up loose ends of SB 35, where there was kind of a hole that cities were trying to work around? And I have my notes here, I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place.
Find that for you.
It seems as though whenever land use legislation comes out, a city goes, all right, where's the workaround? And then another law comes in and goes, all right, nope, I think we plugged that hole. Wait, nope, found another workaround. And from what I was reading, and now I've just more than confused myself, I think that's the trend. I mean, we've had 150 laws passed in the last, 5 years or so? And it's getting stricter and stricter, especially if the number is now, instead of 180,000, it's 300 and, what was it, 320,000? So is that kind of the trend that you guys are seeing in planning, that it's just more and more heavier and heavier, taking away city autonomy?
That's one way to describe it. They are being a little more, or they're being quite a bit more specific in the language.
Okay.
And one thing that's related to that comment is, as of, I believe it went into effect this year, if not, it was last year, to show how serious the state is in terms of implementing housing law, they now have a brand new division called the Housing Accountability Unit.
Yes, I've read about them.
And they're the ones that if they receive a comment or a complaint from anyone stating that a city is not, they're not in compliance either with housing element law, or they're violating, say, SB 35 or SB 330, they're the ones that come out and say, okay, first we're going to talk to you, we're going to help educate you and encourage you. But if that doesn't work, here's a whole criteria of actions we're going to go through. So at this point in time, their sole purpose is to hopefully encourage compliance, but if not, they can go as far as decertifying your housing element.
Thank you.
For that, the terrific questions and the excellent presentation. I just have some wrap-up questions. So a big picture question is, I think you started your presentation by like a charge, really. 300,000, how many units?
320,000 units over the next 8 years annually.
Right. I mean, that's attainable, but one issue, the small little point, is that the city of Vacaville doesn't build housing. Right? I mean, the city can't compel housing to be built. So, for those of us who love economics, there are markets. And these markets are created by constraints on time and supply. So if the city has no control about the market, they issue the housing permit, right? Is there anything that deals with that second constraint about time? So one reason that the housing is so expensive is because there's a limited supply. And we can't make developers pull permits and build housing.
Correct.
Is there anything in this matrix that has addressed that time constraint? Or is that something that we can do locally?
It's something we can do locally. So we're not quite to the point where we are being told, specifically, you must do X. Housing element law is meant to encourage and incentivize the production of housing. But you're absolutely right. An actual city or a county does not build housing. But we are required to remove any kind of constraints that are within our power. And that has everything to do with reducing or lightening development and design criteria. A big part of it has to do with streamlining different housing entitlements and getting those permits in the hands of developers faster There's also ways that we can incentivize them by reducing fees or delaying fees, or deferring fees, I should say. But there isn't anything right now, to my knowledge, in housing law that says you must build 200 homes annually. We're not there. Hopefully, we'll never get there. But we are required to do everything else up until that point.
Yeah, I mean, so the challenge that I have is that it seems like we just assume bad faith, that the cities are acting in bad faith, and the developers are these poor babies that, need you to remove all the constraints. And, I'm being flip, but I really, just, it's not that complex in terms of understanding how the market works. If there's a very limited supply of housing, then a developer can get more for the cost of the product that she's building. So my question is, does the legislature have anything, well, you've already answered that question. Does the city have anything in its toolkit to make housing more affordable in Vacaville in light of the market conditions that may exist on constrained housing and the costs being driven up because of that?
Well, I'm definitely not an economist either, in addition to not being an attorney.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. The one thing that all local jurisdictions have in their power is we get to choose the general plan land use designations and the zoning designations. So perhaps we need to look at having fewer large lot subdivisions and having more small lot subdivisions. Maybe we need to look at increasing the number of high density sites we have throughout the city, which, by the way, we do. It's all in our draft housing element. So as part of our draft housing element, one of the programs calls out for us to look at increasing the amount of density permitted in all residential land use categories. So I believe right now we allow 3 to 5 units in low density residential. I'm making this up. We might say we're going to require 4 to 8 units in low density residential. And
I don't want to interrupt you, but I don't want to move off that first point that you're making, because are you saying that with small lot designations that it might make the market more attainable for all various size of developers? Would that be the outcome, or what would, for instance, the small lot designations do for the challenge?
The idea is the smaller the home, the more affordable it's going to be by design. So you may have heard the term missing middle housing numerous times over the last few years. That is something that all California jurisdictions are currently looking at. So you may recall in the 1990s, we had that thing called the McMansions. Now we're going the opposite way. The pendulum is swinging back, and we're looking at more densely populated areas, and, well, I should say areas, neighborhoods, more densely populated neighborhoods. And we're looking at more high density, low medium density. And we're moving away from estates and low density.
Well, the other benefit, as we've seen in just the development of the environmental justice movement, is that large lot zoning accompanies a certain type of consumer and really ices people out of the market who are, first-time home buyers or more diverse. So the other thing you mentioned was the general plan designation. Can you elaborate on that?
So the general plan land use designation goes hand in hand with zoning. So in order for an area to be zoned low density residential, it must have a consistent general plan land use designation, which is typically also going to be residential low density. It's not the zoning district per se that tells you how many units you get per acre. It's your general plan. So the general plan is the big overarching plan the city must abide by, and the zoning plan is an implementation tool. So in order to change the zoning code and that map, we have to change the general plan map as well.
But returning to the issue of time constraints, because, for instance, we have this housing challenge right now. if we're letting developers build houses over a 20-year term, there's no guarantee that they're going to pull the permits within the 5-year, within the near term. And so we're going to languish in this housing crisis as long as the term is broad. Would you agree with that, or is that too abstract?
Really has to do with the market. It can change from year to year. I know some members on our council, they have, informed us correctly that a lot of housing construction has slowed down, not so much because of materials not being available, has to do with the interest rates. So it can be based on numerous factors that are outside of local jurisdictions' control. So I don't know if there's any one answer to that question.
Director Morris?
Thank you, Chair Klein, and thank you, Tyra. You're providing answers to the question. I just want to add a little more. I think you're asking, Chair Klein, about development agreements and about if you allow a long-term, isn't that at odds with producing housing now? I think that you're sort of heading into the development agreement territory. Is my clarifying question, is that what you're asking about?
I wouldn't assume that, I mean, that would be a part of it. I just wouldn't assume that development agreements would be the only way that we could get housing built quickly. But if that's the main tool, then it would be a development agreement question.
So starting off with the development agreements, most of them for like a large master plan community will actually be quite long-term just because of the cost of all the infrastructure, the time it takes to build it, the time it takes to produce the units, and also you can't produce 2,000 units and have them all entering the market at the same time. So there's a certain pacing effect for that. But as far as other tools cities can use to make housing happen now, I just want to share a little vignette from our department right now. The City Council, for the first time in 30 years, has updated our development impact fees. And up until the end of this month, which actually for us ends on June 29th, because we're not working on the 30th, it's a Saturday, developers of housing can take advantage of a hybrid fee program where they can either take the lower fee from the old fee schedule or the new one in each fee category. And we've actually gotten a big uptick in building permit activity, as Assistant Director Montmayor will share when he does the building permit update. We have 2 multifamily projects and like 70-ish single-family homes all vying to get their permits issued by the end of this month, June 29th, that's next week, because there's an incentive for developers to move forward and pull their permits because they're going to get the lowest impact fees. For the good of the community, though, the new development impact fees also, they're going to be higher in some cases, but they actually provide an incentive for developers to build smaller homes. For the first time in Vacaville's history, if you build a smaller home, you're going to pay a fee that's lower than if you build a bigger home. So I'd say like impact fees are a tool cities can use, but we have to be careful. Whatever the fees are set at has to relate to the impact the project's creating. So you can't just say, you know what, we're going to waive all the housing fees because then we wouldn't have the money to build the critical sewer and water infrastructure. But there's some of that is helpful. And then I would say also part of our housing element, and these are other tools, and it may sound like a weak tool, but in my experience, it is not. We're actually required by the state to have meetings with the development community over the next few years about what we can do to reduce impediments to construction. We're required to have meetings with nonprofit service providers. And I actually, in my career, I've experienced that even talking about housing, it doesn't produce it exactly, but if people know that the city of Vacaville is serious about producing housing, and if we have a good development review process that's streamlined, people do want to live in Vacaville, and developers will meet that need. I hope that's helpful.
No, I think that is helpful. I'm just mindful of the comment you made about if they build some number of units and they all come online at the same time, like that's really what we're talking about. Because if they build the units and they all come online, the home buyer benefits, the low income home buyer benefits, the first, the single parent household that typically it would have been out of their reach before. They benefit from that. So I just think it's a balance where if we could, nudge the balance for the little guy who doesn't have as much of a down payment or whatever, just to bring down the cost of buying a house, and so you're not just stuck renting a house for the rest of your life. I think that's only going to be done if you have some kind of a market change, and that shift benefits not the developer. And that's if you're looking at it as a linear, X, Y sort of thing. And I just don't know enough about it to say whether or not it's that kind of a linear choice. Is everything we do for the to bring down the cost of the development necessarily hurt the developer? Or is there a way for everybody to win? And that's to make it so that the first-time home buyer we can widen that pool of people who can afford to buy a home, because there's a lot of housing coming on market, and the prices are being decreased considerably. Because my one real challenge with the legislature's rush here is that I don't know how are these fixes designed to make an impact on those market conditions in real time. And so it sounds like the answer is no, but the local government is at the same time is kind of vilified, as if to say that local governments aren't doing enough and that they're trying to make it harder to build housing. And I don't know if that's always, I have not seen that in my time in Vacaville in planning. So these laws are very confusing. And I know you're not a legislative analyst, but you did a great job explaining all this. I appreciate your attentiveness to our issues. Ashley?
Yeah, I have one more question. The California state income limits just came out again for the housing authority. Does that have any, and I know they change somewhat every year, does that impact any of this at all? And I know that there used to be 3 levels of low income, and now there's acutely low income as well, which is like the 0 to 15% poverty line.
We're going to have to look at, and thank you for the question, Commissioner Banta. We're going to have to look at how the additional income levels affects us. But it has been, every year we get updated income limits, and every year our housing programs and affordability relates to those new incomes. Even between one presentation made at council earlier this year to the next, suddenly there were updated numbers. So it's an annual process we go through every year.
Okay.
I did have one last question about the diversity. There was a bill that specifically impacts diversity, and you said that that's not a Vacaville concern. Can you just briefly elaborate on that? I unfortunately I did not write down the bill number. I think it was an assembly bill.
Yes, so it's Assembly Bill 2873, sponsored by Jones and Sawyer. And the idea is to promote diversity in affordable housing development. Now, what I mean by this doesn't apply to Vacaville, what I should have stated, just to make it a little more clear, is this is not a land use bill, nor is it a housing element requirement. What this is it's a bill that has to do with the state and affordable housing developers to encourage more diversity within the construction of more affordable homes through nonprofits.
Okay.
So they want to incentivize the nonprofit organizations to hire more diverse workers by giving them more funding for their projects. So this doesn't happen at our level. This is something that happens much higher and prior to it coming to the city.
So how would we witness this locally after it's been kicked into action by the state?
Well, I hope I don't speak out of turn here. Really, everything having to do with funding and affordable housing goes through our Housing and Community Services Department. But when we have a new project come in that's being proposed by a nonprofit, and they are focusing on providing affordable housing, they are required to submit their funding information. So through that submittal of their funding information, the city would see whether or not they received a specific type of funding, and that funding may have been directly related to this assembly bill. So if something came in through our housing department, Director Cantu might be able to look through it and go, oh, they did indeed increase the diversity within their hiring practices. That's the only way we'd be aware that this had been, excuse me, had been applied to a project here in Vacaville.
So it's not a land use bill, but it's
It
like
is not a land use bill.
a funding. Okay, terrific. Thank you very much for that presentation. We'll now turn to item 9. Director Morris, please give us your report.
In just a moment, the presentation will be up. I'll do my report followed by the others. And I'll actually just get started while they're getting the slides up. So on the first one, City Council updates. At the May 23rd meeting, the council declared May Building Safety Week, actually month. May was Building Safety Month, and so that was exciting for our building division. And then also, I presented an inclusionary housing study session with Director Emily Cantu to the council. And we didn't get direction from the council, but we did. It was a very educational session, lots of questions, and there are some follow-ups that I'll be pursuing. And then on June 13th, there were a couple items on the agenda that were noteworthy to our department, but not necessarily the Planning Commission. You've expressed interest in solar energy, so we have a grant to implement a new solar permitting system that should be very efficient and also will bring us into compliance with state law, and that was authorized. And then we did a budget study session, and the building division, it looked good, on June 27th, may be acquiring a full-time plan check engineer to help us with our plan review process. And then at the upcoming council meeting, there will be hopefully that budget adoption that I just mentioned. The council will be considering adoption of the housing element, the safety element, the community health goals, policies, and actions, and also the land use and development codes. And these are all items that the commission saw at your last meeting. So the council is going to be very busy on June 27th with a lot of things that you all saw. And then if I can go on to the next slide. For Planning Commission, unfortunately, both North Village and Dutch Brothers were continued, but they were both continued to a date certain, and we are hopeful that we'll be bringing both items to this commission for public hearing and decision, or in the case of North Village recommendation, in the case of Dutch Brothers decision at next month's meeting. This commission will also be reviewing the Montesa House plans. It's not clear if that's in July or in August, but it's on the cusp of coming here, so be prepared. And then I'm still working on a timeline for bringing the urban reserve to commission and council. And then I was asked recently by the city manager to bring the council a study session on objective design standards in July. And so now I just need to do some conversation to figure out, am I going to also bring that here? I know that this commission has expressed interest in objective design standards. So it's a full-on study session that Commissioner Banta and Vice Chair Radine and I actually saw a preview of at the League conference. And then the only other thing of note I want to say for our department is that this year, this is like not related to planning exactly, but I attended the city's first Juneteenth event. It was last week. It was a small event at the Senior Center, and I just want to say it was amazing. I learned a lot about Juneteenth, and just put it on your calendar next year. Our city will be doing a bigger Juneteenth event. We started off with a 45-minute conversation with the community about what Juneteenth is, and then next year, hopefully more. So I just want to share that. It was fun, and onward to the next part of this update, which is going to be tackled by Assistant Director Montmayor.
Thanks, Erin. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. So I'll kick it off with the Building Division monthly report. So overall, there was a downward trend from the previous month. With the exception of our inspection team, we were up by 76 compared to the previous month. Since we were down to building inspectors, scheduling of inspections has been backed up, but we're working on it, addressing the backlog and getting back to more normal with our scheduling windows. We did recently wrap up interviews for a building inspector vacancy, so we hope to have that fully staffed and get our inspection team back up to par soon. Here's a bar graph showing how our building permit issuance is starting to trend downwards. This was expected, and we've accommodated this type of trend in our fiscal year 23-24 budget. And as Director Morris mentioned, though, we did have some interest in developers coming in to pull in before the end of the fiscal year to take advantage of the hybrid fee program. So maybe we might see this trend go upwards next month. Here's a bar graph showing the solar permits issued monthly since May 2022. Compared to last year, our total solar permits issued this May compared to May of 2022 shows that we're still higher despite the downward trend. And here's a comparative correlating line graph to show the relation between single-family permits issued and solar permits issued. The peaks and valleys show a correlating trend, and both show downwards trend in May. So sliding into current planning, while we continue to maintain an intake of steadily new planning applications, we do see an overall trend also in the planning division of new applications starting to trickle. So with new applications coming in only in districts 1, 2, 5, and 6 in the last month, comparatively all districts back in April did show new application activity across all throughout the city. So we're seeing also a reduction in planning entitlement applications. And lastly, we have our advanced planning monthly report. Just as a reminder, we're bringing forth the adoption hearing of the housing element, safety element, and community health policies on June 27th. And if you would like to see those documents, we can email it to you. Otherwise, check out these links. That concludes the report. Punting it back to Erin.
One final comment. I want to thank the commissioners that toured our sewer treatment plant here in Vacaville. We did it in 2 groups. It was not a meeting. It was 2 tours. I just want to thank you all for spending time with community development staff and most importantly, our utility staff that actually know how to run a sewer treatment plant. So thank you all for participating in our first field trip in recent memory. That concludes our director's report.
Thank you. I would only add that you guys are not below par. You're just understaffed. So you're doing a lot with the staff that you have. I have a quick question about the solar permits. Do you anticipate any change to the amount of solar permits that we're going to need to be issuing in light of the change to the tariff or the policies with? Do you understand what I'm saying? That there's the change to net billing. The tariff is the PUC set amount.
I don't have enough information to answer that. Dr. Morris, you might have.
I'm happy to answer that question. Right now, it's a wait and see, but we do anticipate that less homeowners will be motivated to install personal systems since they will no longer be getting quite the same amount back or reduced in their bill. But it's only been a very short time since that old program sunsetted, so we're going to be in wait and see mode. And every month we bring you this chart. We're all going to learn together what's happening out there.
And we're not going to blame you guys when we see the numbers dip, though. So I'm putting that out there now. The numbers will dip. Thank you very much for the director's report for all involved. We're now to the time where we take commissioner comments. This portion of the agenda is for commissioners to inform each other of items of potential interest to other commissioners, such as interagency meetings or other announcements as appropriate. We'll start off by going down the line. Vice Chair Rudin.
I have no comments.
Oh, keep it light. Good.
Finished. Happy Father's Day, everybody. Wanted to note over the weekend in a neighboring community, there was a indoor sports tournament that benefited that community over $1 million. And so in one short weekend, a county and 3 cities were able to benefit quickly off of $1 billion of revenue coming to that area. And I just would hope and like to see something like that in the future, be able to not just help our district, but our area, but maybe even our region, because $1 billion coming into a community helps food and service, helps hotels, helps the TOT tax. So that's revenue of people coming in, but those families don't also have to travel out. And many who've played sports or done other community events, we're always seem like we're traveling out of Solano County. And so it's just something I wanted to highlight that I saw, and I thought it was fantastic. Also, happy Juneteenth. It's a significant holiday that marks the nation's progress toward equity and freedom, but we must also acknowledge our challenges ahead. It continues to sadden me the low percentage of African Americans who are homeowners. But we also need to understand that homeownership is the key to creating generational wealth. Every African American individual deserves an opportunity to enjoy the benefits of homeownership and the pride of owning their own private property, because private property are the most protected rights in the state of California. So just, as Director Morris brought up Juneteenth, it really brought up just thinking about the percentage of African Americans who don't own homes and the effect of the generational wealth that has on that family and that household, and how that continues to affect, kids going to college and stuff like that. So just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. And lastly, happy anniversary, honey.
Did you say $1 billion or $1 million? You said,
Million.
Okay, so $1 million. And which district?
It was up 80. County. It was
Oh.
up 80, but they had an indoor sports tournament. Economic developer of the county and the tourism executive were able to show how they benefited $1 million. So, I mean, it was a sports tournament that was partnered with the CIF and the NCAA. So it was really outside thinking. It was the first time that's happened in Northern California, I believe. So, but it was an indoor facility where that area just said, we're going all in on this. We're not going to do some of this. We're not going to do some of that. We're just going to be really good at doing this. So they're really good at indoor facility. A lot of revenue for that area.
Where's that? And so I'm sorry, I missed it. Which community was it? Placer?
Placer County.
Ah.
Always want to highlight, the other counties that are doing good, but
Well, not Brand X.
under
Too far away from
duress, I'll tell you it was Placer.
Under duress. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Is that?
Good, yep.
Okay. I do want to acknowledge Commissioner Fortney. I think at our last meeting, I want to apologize if I cut you off in some way. I try to be respectful to everybody, and please just let me know. Running these meetings, as you know, is not always, your jokes aren't always as funny as you'd think that they are. But, well, like that one wasn't funny, I guess. So,
Thank you. Appreciate
yeah,
that.
appreciate you. So, anyway, with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.